Hello, everybody. Welcome to an experiment. Today, we're trying something completely and utterly new. It's going to be even more informal than the normal chats, and this is because we want to develop something slightly more informal in terms of the conversations we have. And today, I'm delighted to have with me Natalie Tobert and also my good friend Sarah Janes. And what the three of us are going to be doing is having an informal discussion about matters that interest the three of us. And also, I know there are matters that interest you guys out there as well. Now, we're going to run for initially around about an hour in terms of our general conversation. And then what we'll do is we'll open it up to comments, requests, suggestions from various other people who have been following us on Facebook as this goes live. So really, without further ado, what I quickly like to do is to have my two associates just introduce themselves very, very quickly. And then Natalie will take over a little bit because there's a few questions she wants to ask me about my recent book. And in terms of that, I will be responding to that and I'll be asking Natalie questions back. So guys, if maybe, Sarah, you could just quickly introduce yourself.
Hello, so my name's Sarah Janes and I met Anthony working on the Drakelow Tunnels event where we tried to recreate the Plato's Cave experiment, and that was a hoot, and we've become friends. And I run a online lecture salon called the Explorers Club, on which Anthony's been a guest, and we've had some crossover of guests actually, haven't we, Anthony?
We have.
And just recently I've been getting quite obsessed about Egyptology. So Anthony asked me if I would help him facilitate this conversation, which I'm very happy to do.
And indeed, going forward as well, so thank you very much for that. It's much appreciated. And Natalie.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me today. My background lies within medical anthropology, and I've worked in India and in Africa, and I'm particularly interested in different ways of understanding consciousness and out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences. And I developed a course for medical schools and hospitals, which I run, teaching students and staff about different ways that different populations understand their experiences and why they may or may not accept treatment. So that's me.
Good, and I think everybody listening in probably knows who I am, and probably doesn't need an introduction. But as time goes on, we'll probably expand upon that. Now, Natalie, I know that you're very keen to ask me a series of questions, which we'll use as a structure in terms of moving forward. So, if you're ready to fire away, I feel like I'm in the black chair in Mastermind, and see if I can answer them as best I can. We can theme in. And Sarah, again, if you want to come in at any time, want to make any comments, please feel free to do so.
Can I ask you, if Aldous Huxley was alive today, what would he make of your book and what's going on in around society?
That always worried me when I wrote the book. I was thinking, what on earth would Aldous Huxley make of this? And would he think that I was being presumptive by calling it opening the doors of perception? But on reflection, I'd like to believe that he was a searcher like we were. He was somebody that was looking for answers to literally what he called a perennial philosophy, wasn't it? The idea that there is in some way another level of reality that we exist within, and that consciousness is not something that is created by the brain, but is something that's facilitated by the brain. So I think he would be very, very interested in what is taking place at the moment, because society seems to be going through a very curious changes that are being facilitated by COVID, but it's something more than that, I think. And the way we're all reacting to it. I mean, funny enough, Sarah and I were chatting earlier on today, and we were discussing about how we are all now communicating in a very different way. We're now getting used to this kind of communication using Zoom and using social media to communicate our ideas, which means that we're in a position to seek out people who share our own ideas. Now, that is both a positive thing, and I think it's also incredibly dangerous. And I think Aldous Huxley would be, in Brave New World, he discussed exactly these issues that we are living in now, the idea of state control and everything else as well. And I read recently, somebody said that, in fact, as a reflection of modern society, it's not 1984. It's not George Orwell's world we're living in. It's very much Aldous Huxley's world. And I think to a degree we're right on that. And of course, Aldous Huxley then subsequently in the early 1960s wrote a book, I think it was The Island, which was the one about Soma and altered states of consciousness, which is a little known book of his. But again, it is something that he was so advanced in his thinking and so advanced in his ideas. Now, the reason I decided to call the book Opening the Doors of Perception was because in 1954, Aldous Huxley managed to get hold through the ministrations of a British psychiatrist who was based in Saskatchewan in Canada, a guy called Humphrey Osmond. He managed to get hold of some mescaline. Now, initially, he was supposed to go up to Canada to take it, but because there were problems, Osmond actually brought the drug down with him down to California, where Aldous Huxley then took the substance. And yeah, we must actually revise, these substances, they are illegal in certain areas, and we know we're not advocating people take them. But what they seem to do is they say, as Aldous Huxley said, they open our doors of perception. They open us up to a wider perceptual field. And of course, when he did his experiments, it was some of the things he mentioned, was the way in which he could see things in greater detail that he'd never really looked at before. And in that way, I'm reminded of Jacob Boehme, who very much said a very famous statement many years ago. And he said, one could go insane by looking at a pewter dish. And of course, this is exactly what happened in many ways to people who started taking entheogens and everything else, because you suddenly see the world in a very different way. And Huxley was quite fascinated by the ideas of people like Henri Bergson. And Bergson's idea of the brain as an attenuator, that the brain takes out information. And of course, from that, C.D. Broad, the British psychiatrist as well, was of similar nature. And he believed that you open the doors of perception. Of course, using the term open doors of perception, he was using, I think it was from Songs of Innocence by William Blake. And it's a line where William Blake, and I'm paraphrasing, says, if we open the doors of perception, we'd see reality as it really is, infinite, but we're locked in the confines of our cavern, which is exactly one of the points that Sarah was making before about the work we did in terms of Plato's Cave at Drakelo last year. So I think he would be probably very, very pleased with what's happening. And of course, there's a sad proviso here. One of the reasons that Aldous Huxley was so fascinated by altered states of consciousness was he was losing his sight. So for him, it was a way of seeing an inner world that his external physiology was not allowing him to do. So he was going inward to see inward. So yes, I think he'd be very pleased. And I think it would be wonderful if we would ever have the opportunity to have him as a guest on this show, because I'm sure that it would have been fascinating to talk to him. But if you're looking there, wherever you are, Aldous, whether you're out there in the Bohemian IMAX or wherever you are, my sincere apologies if you don't like me taking your title, but it was such a wonderful one.
Thank you. You probably would need to get a good psychic medium in to see if he would say hello. But can I ask you something else? You spoke about people who take substances and they open the doors of perception. And
that must be Aldous now. Aldous is coming through.
He
wants to speak to us.
Can I ask, how do you explain those people who are diagnosed with mental health problems because they see things that other people can't see? There appear to be very thin boundaries between the world, and they're not taking substances. They're not, it can happen that people take substances, but how do you explain so many thousands of people who have experiences of open door perception without taking medication?
That was exactly the reason that stimulated me writing the book, because it has long intrigued me. Ever since my first book came out in 2006, I've been approached by people who have had extraordinary experiences. And many of these individuals are neurotypicals, as well as people who have classic migraine, people who experience temporal lobe epilepsy, and people who experience schizophrenia. And all of these are very much states of mind or states of perception that are not facilitated by external substances. Whatever is taking place here, either there are substances that are being generated endogenously, either through endogenous generation of possibly DMT within the brain, we can touch on that later, or whether there is something more going on. And in the book, I present what I call my Huxleyan spectrum. And by the Huxleyan spectrum, I mean that there is a continuum of the way in which the doors of perception can be opened. For many people, the doors of perception are tightly closed, or they are tightly closed for our everyday self, the being I call the eidolon, which is our self that lives life just once, and that is our everyday self. We are all eidolons here now. I can't speak for both of you, but I assume you're eidolons. Whereas we all have also an element of the higher self, what we commonly known as the higher self, which I call the daemon. And I would argue that what sometimes is happening here is the levels of communication between eidolonic consciousness and demonic consciousness are facilitated. Now, as a very simplistic argument, I say that the brain has two sections to it, the right and left hemisphere communicating by the corpus callosum. And I think under certain circumstances, there is more communication across the channels between the dominant and non-dominant hemispheres, in which case the eidolonic consciousness can somehow access demonic consciousness, which I argue is... All right, so very much Sarah's just said that there's no sign of the recording being live on Facebook. That's interesting. So we're not going out recording this anyway. So if we're not losing it, it will just have to go out subsequently. But it's definitely telling me live on Facebook. According to me, I've got the live tag on the top. That sometimes people can attune into the demonic consciousness, which I think is attuning into a much broader scale. It effectively overrides the Bergsonian reducing engine, effectively. Now, what I then think is that there is a continuum. So there's neurotypicals who just sometimes, because of extraordinary circumstances, I think sometimes it may happen that you're under extreme stress, you're under shock, or something stimulates a release of something within the brain which opens up the doors of perception. But as we actually move away from neurotypicals, I think there are a group of individuals who can have altered states of consciousness quite regularly. And I'm one of those individuals because I'm a classic migrainer. And I think under the aura state within classic migraine, I think the doors of perception are open ever so slightly. And again, if anybody's interested, it's well worth reading Oliver Sacks's book on migraine, because it was quite a fascinating book about how altered states take place. Moving on from there, I think you can then move into an overlap between classic migraine, temporal lobe epilepsy, where the doors are wider again. And suddenly people can flip between the worlds almost. And the scores of temporal lobe epileptics that have contacted me over the years all reinforce this. They all tell me that when they are in aura states, they go somewhere completely different. Not only that, but they actually meet another version of themselves, which again, I would argue is demonic consciousness manifesting itself. We then move into schizophrenia when I argue that the Bergsonian spectrum moves to there, and the doors are so widely open that the person can't deal with it. It's psychic overload. The sounds are brighter. They are hearing voices. And again, Natalie, in one of your papers, you referenced the Hearing Voices Network, which is an incredibly important organization for individuals who hear voices, because it's far more common than people generally believe. I mean, for instance, we all know that Sarah's almost namesake, Julian Jaynes, when he wrote his book on the bicameral mind, I think in 1970, was it 71, whatever it was, a Princetown psychiatrist, he started this because he was hearing voices. And he argues that until we acquired until our brains became bicameral, that is, but two parts of it, we heard the voice of the gods. We heard our own inner dialogue, but we interpreted that inner dialogue as being the voice of the gods. And in this book, The Bicameral Mind, James argues that if you look back on the writings of the pre-Socratics and you look at the writings of people like Homer, there is no inner dialogue of the characters. The characters respond to what the gods tell them. It's as if they are experiencing the world in a very, very different way. And could be this is what is taking place in terms of probably more traditional societies who are closer to the world, as it were. They're more in the world than we are. We are outside of the world. We exist in boxes, in cars, in aircraft. We rarely spend the night under the stars. And I think people in those circumstances, they're more attuned to the subtleties of how the universe really works. Their doors of perception are automatically open. We then move into, and very much this is what Julian Jaynes argued. And he also argued some fascinating things. I think it was Julian Jaynes that argued that even our levels of perception have changed. I mean, for instance, there's a curious line in the Iliad where Homer says the wine dark Aegean Sea, which is a curious statement because the Aegean Sea isn't wine dark. It's not red in that way. So clearly, the way our language structures, the way our brain structures and what it allows in is how we structure our internal model of what external reality is. And I think this is anthropologists like yourself are discovering this more and more, that, you know, we can't be too culturally biased in when we go into research into traditional civilizations and cultures, because of course they have their shamanic techniques, they have the shamanic world that people travel within, the levels of communication that people have in these levels. You know, people can distance view, they can remote view, they get information from different places. We just dismiss this because in our scientific worldview, these things cannot be explained by materialist reductionist science. Therefore, the logic is they don't exist. But if people experience them, we have to. And again, I think in one of your papers, Natalie, you made that very, very powerful point. You know, that just because the Western civilizations, European civilization, North American, Australian civilization has this worldview, it doesn't mean it's the correct one. It means that we are blinkered by, and our lives are structured and our perceptions are structured by our language, by our education, and by everything else. And again, earlier I was talking to Sarah about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, the idea that our language itself structures our understanding of the world. And the words we use, the grammatical forms, you know, whether our verbs are transitive or intransitive, whether we have a kind of permanent present, whether the permanent present spreads wider, you know, that you know, the concept of the specious present of James. You know, the idea that other societies, they have a broader spectrum. And I think moving on then to schizophrenia, to that we can then add things like autism, when we have got what I think it was Marklow called it the wild world syndrome of people who have autism, which is so similar, isn't it, in many ways to what schizophrenics feel. You know, we now have in our shopping, you know, we have quiet zones and quiet times so that autistic children cannot be traumatized. But autistic children, again, seem to perceive a world that is far greater and far broader than this. We then have, again, what Sarah and I were talking about earlier, synesthetics, you know, whereby the perceptions are melding in. Sight melds into sound and smells into smells and everything else. So even the boundaries of what we consider to be perception merge in some ways. And I think this is all to do possibly with neurotransmitters in the brain. I mean, I'm particularly intrigued, for instance, in something that's happening now that people are noticing more and more is that elderly people, when they start to move into Alzheimer's, they start to perceive the world in a different way. My mother did this. And there's a friend of mine, Maggie Latourelle, who wrote a book called The Gift of Alzheimer's. And in this book, she describes her mother's decline, for want of a better term, into Alzheimer's. But effectively, while she was doing this, she was seeing dead people. She'd become precognitive. She was seeing things that were taking place miles away. She was remote viewing. All these things were accurate. These things happen. And Natalie and I, we both feel so frustrated by this because we just want these altered states of consciousness to be nice. And near-death experiences, you only ever have nice near-death experiences and it's all fluffy and you're in a cloud and everything else. Other people don't have nice near-death experiences. Some of them are traumatic, but we never report them.
How do we manage where we've now got scholars who are doing research on altered states of consciousness, on psychism, on mediumship, on clairvoyance, on after-death communication? How do we do that? Because they've acknowledged that there are altered states of consciousness, but the research protocol that they use, and this is just I've seen last week and the week before, the research protocol that scholars use excludes people with so-called mental health problems. So they're looking into altered states of consciousness, but they're still using the stigma of mental health that goes back 20, 30, 40 years. How do we come to terms with that?
Well, it's curious, isn't it, that when we look back in history, we look back at conversion situations in terms of, St. Paul on the road to Damascus. We have the situation where individuals see spirits and everything else as well. We have cases of people like Hildegard of Bingen and the way she was painting the world she was seeing, right through to modern times in terms of modern religious movements. These individuals would probably these days to be considered to be insane. And what is insanity? Insanity is just reacting differently to external stimuli that other people cannot see. Like, for instance, somebody when they hallucinate, the definition of hallucination is seeing something that nobody else sees. That doesn't mean it's not real. Just because other people don't see it, even if it's inside your head, we need to then define what we mean by reality. We know that our external world is modeled internally by the brain. The brain models a three-dimensional version of reality, or what it thinks is reality, right back here in the visual cortex of the brain. And it does that from a postage stamp inverted image from the retina. Okay. Not only that, but it doesn't do it from photons. It doesn't do it from light photons. It does it from an electrical impulse. So the signal of the photons is converted into an electrochemical impulse, which then is transferred down the optic chiasma to the darkest part of the brain, where it is then recreated again. Not only is it then recreated, it's recreated with illumination. When people have DMT experiences, when people have out-of-the-body experiences, there is an illumination source. There's a light source, but there's no light source here. So this itself means that we need to relook at what we mean by hallucinations, in which case we then have to look at, well, why are these people acting strangely? Well, within their own mind, and I remember thinking this many years ago, even the guy that's baying at the moon outside, that's a total literal lunatic, he is reacting rationally to the stimulation he is receiving. It's just that the stimulation he is receiving is different. So what we have to do here is to start thinking differently. We've got to stop thinking, we chemically neuter these people by just throwing drugs at them and giving them all kinds of drugs to put them into different states of consciousness. Now, again, an associate friend of mine, which hopefully will be joining us later, Ed, who's actually waiting to come in at the moment because I've noticed he's here, will be able to tell us some of these things that have been happening with his son. Now, if this is the case, science has to realize we don't know everything. 94% of the universe is missing, for God's sake. It's dark matter and dark energy. And yet we stand there and we think we understand it. We don't understand black holes. We don't understand perception. We don't understand how the brain creates consciousness. Chalmers' hard problem of science. So the arrogance and the hubris here is powerful. And we're missing a trick because these people can tell us things, extraordinary things about the reality that's around us. And the only way we're going to be able to do this is to make people realize that the present scientific paradigm is very, very explanatory and very, very good for the world we live within. But as a total explanator of the totality of reality, it fails. It fails in so many ways. We have wave-particle duality. We have subatomic particles that are either waves or particles, depending on whether they're observed or whether they're measured or not. We have known this since the 1920s, since the quantum revolution, since Niels Bohr, Max Born, and Erwin Schrödinger. All these individuals, and what's interesting, all of those characters all became virtual mystics when they got towards the end of their lives. Schrödinger wrote a wonderful book called What is Life? We had Wolfgang Pauli working with Jung on synchronicity. Max Born, various other individuals. It's because they realize that what the universe is telling us is important, but we're not listening. We are so, as I would say, with using the Plato analogy again, we are so chained down, looking at the shadows on the wall. We're not listening to the guy who's already taken off his shackles, has gone, seen the fire and the shadow, and seen the source of the shadows and the fire, and gone to the entrance of the cave, seen reality as it really is, comes back and says to us, hey guys, it's not what you think it is. It's far more amazing. And what do? We label them as being insane. That's not science, that's scientism.
But how do we do it? Because now the scientists and the scholars are investigating anomalous experiences, out-of-body experiences, psychic experiences, but they're still using the protocols of excluding people who've been identified with mental health problems. So we're doing we're exploring new paradigms with the research, but we're using old protocols. And I don't know what to do about that, because it makes me very frustrated. So on the one hand, we're acknowledging that these experiences exist and we're conducting research into them, but we're not looking, how is this good for society? What difference can it make for people who've been diagnosed with mental health problems?
I think the problem is that science, particularly parapsychology, as it was when I was at university many years ago as a sociologist, is that we're so preoccupied in the social sciences to want to have credibility. And the only way you can have credibility is playing more hardball than the quantum physicists. For instance, we know that within physiology, the people that are the biologists are the ones that are really holding back on the information that science is telling us. That's why I'm delighted to see people like my friend John Joe McFadden at the University of Surrey now doing his work is now being noticed in terms of his argument that within the brain, consciousness is a field around the neurons, which is intriguing stuff. But we need to break out of this. We need to, again, I'm reminded here of the Thomas Kuhn and the theory of revolutions. We are coming to the end of a particular paradigm now, and we are going through the pain of the change, whereby we're almost like the medieval schoolmen, that had their epicycles in to explain retrograde motion of the outer planets, because they were so grounded in the idea that the Earth was the center of the universe, or was the center of the solar system. They were observing things that didn't fit in, but instead of actually just going with the information and saying, what does this tell us? They come up with epicycles and wheels within wheels that try to explain the observed phenomenon. And I believe this is what modern science is doing now. I mean, for instance, within cosmology, there is a big gap from the Big Bang. There is a period of time that really doesn't make sense. We really don't know what happened. So we come up with this wonderful idea of hyperinflation, whereby the universe seemed to expand for no apparent reason, using no apparent motive force or anything, expanded from nothing, and expanded at thousands of times the speed of light. And that's only to accommodate the size it seemed to be at that time. And I think the same happens with psychology, with psychiatry. Because remember, psychiatry is a wonderful tool, but it's not based upon actual experimentation, is it? It's based upon interpretation. The way in which certain psychiatric illnesses get defined within the big book they have is that somebody comes along and says, this is what we think it is, and these are the symptoms of this, and you can diagnose from these symptoms. And then we change the names, don't we? We have multiple personality syndrome. Then we changed it to dissociative personality syndrome. We keep relabeling these things, but we're not actually achieving anything in understanding them. So what we need to do is to get the scientists that are interested, and there is a new group of scientists coming up now. I'm interviewing more and more of them. As somebody once said, I can't remember who it was, a famous statement when he said, science does not change by new ideas. It changes by the death of the people that held the old ideas. And it's starting to happen now. We've got quantum physicists like Vlatko Vedrel, who's coming forward with the new model that the universe is digital. The universe is made of information. The old David Bohm idea. When we started then applying this to psychic phenomena, when we start applying it to unusual states of consciousness, we then need to draw in the experience, because then we have to go back to pure empiricism. What does empiricism mean? From experience. When somebody has an extraordinary experience, years ago it used to be, oh, they're mad. They're just mad. That's it. We've explained it. It's the label theory, isn't it? They're insane. That's it. It explains it.
Not anymore.
Which is true. Not anymore. They've changed that. I mean, for instance, one of the things in one of my earlier books, I was fascinated. Bleuler, the guy that defined schizophrenia in the Burgersol in Zurich, the hospital he worked in Zurich. There's one thing he describes where there's a schizophrenic guy walking, he's in the room, and the schizophrenic guy turns around and he says, he's walking down the corridor. And then a second later, they heard somebody walking down the corridor. And then he said, he's carrying a mop. And then they heard the mop sound. And then he turns around and says, oh, he's dropped it. And then a split second later, the mop was dropped. Now, you would think that Bleuler would go, that's weird. He was predicting the future a split second before it happened. But no, he just completely ignores it. Utterly ignores it and says that schizophrenics are delusional. But that wasn't a delusion. That was something that was witnessed, showing that the species present for somebody who's schizophrenic is broader. So again, it is simply listen to what people are saying and find out, and just don't label things. I think it will change. And I think discussions like this will change. I mean, Natalie, what's your opinion? What do you think we need to do? I've been prattling on for ages, but what's your opinion? And then maybe we'll turn it over to Sarah and her opinion on this.
Well, it feels like within anthropology or medical anthropology, the data is the person's word before interpretation. So we don't have this. We used to, in the old days, we used to assume that people were superstitious or had different ways of thinking, whereas now what someone says is real data, so we collect it. But my frustration is with people who collect the data on all these kinds of experiences, but don't propose that it's got anything to do with mental health. So they're starting to collect all these types of experience. And I don't know how to get through to the deans of education and the leaders in the medical school and healthcare schools, that the actual protocols that they're using, then they're not looking at it as if it's transferable. So it's almost, if you have benign experiences that are a gift to you and transformational, that's okay. It's a spiritual experience. But if you have a negative experience that's frightening, then it's a mental illness. And I found that when I was conducting research years ago with the Alistair Hardy archive, looking into negative experiences, it was always the belief system of the observer or the belief system of the person that said it was negative or warranted psychiatric care. And I thought, oh, well, that's 20, 30 years ago. It's different now. But then when I went to online, a conference last week, then there's the same stigma attached to people who have negative experiences. I feel people are looked at as if they're a completely different species if they have those open door perception experiences. Rather, if you have a benign experience, then you're having a gift, a religious experience. And I don't know how to raise awareness of that.
I think the danger is, isn't there, that the moment that you cross the barrier and say that a spiritual experience can be negative, it then opens up the suggestion that there could be other entities that are negative, that are manipulating people who are having spiritual experiences, and it cannot necessarily be accepted at face value. And there's a fear there. But I think it is something we have to recognize, that if people in altered states of consciousness have negative experiences, we can't pretend they don't happen. It's just like we can't pretend that negative out-of-body experiences don't take place, because we know people who've had them. We know people who've had negative near-death experiences, and as you say, we just all want it wrapped up nice and cuddly, don't we? And it's nice and fluffy, and it's all wonderful, and it's all nice. But reality is not like that. Reality is indifferent, isn't it? It's not good or bad. I mean, Sarah, what's your opinion on this?
Well, one thing I would really like to bring up is the question of ethics, because I think that's much more at the forefront of modern scholars' minds these days in terms of conducting experiments. And it also influences the choice of the kind of experiments that you're going to do in the first place. I remember going to a conference on memory and emotion, and I asked the person that was in charge of the Sackler Centre for Consciousness Studies at the University of Sussex, what he thought of emotion and memory in dreams. And he said to me, I don't know. And I said, well, what experiments are you doing at the moment? And he said, oh, we're doing an experiment to see whether rats feel regret. And I just thought, that's a really who cares? It's not very important, is it? And I personally think, Anthony knows that my fantasy is to start sleep sanctuaries on a Greek island. And I think it's already happening, that people are within themselves becoming more aware of the things that they can do to preserve their health and to preserve their mental health, their physical health, and cultivate a kind of sense of a balanced spirit and well-being. And people are going to start taking more responsibility for their individual health. And for example, I certainly would avoid ever going to a doctor's or a hospital, because everything about the environment is horrifying to me. It's clinical, scary. Even the way they write letters to their patients is scary. They're kind of threatening, and they don't think about you as being a holistic person with a soul. Like the NHS, there's no mention of having a soul if you go to the doctors, or having a spirit, or any even sovereignty over your own health, which actually I think people do have. But I think ethics is an important aspect to consider, because having friends that have mental health issues that cause them a lot of pain and suffering, I can see that they need some help. They can't really fit into this world often, or at times they feel like they can't fit into this world. They're completely overwhelmed, and it may be better to be telling them that this is something that's occurring in your brain that's not really there, than you really are having conversations with the ghosts of murderers, frankly. And in some instances, I think that the realm of imagination is underestimated, and I think it has a veracity that modern consciousness finds hard to grasp. But actually, the idea of the tulpa or the egregore, your conscious attention on something can manifest a being or an entity into some level of reality for you that can have a very potent effect on your experience of reality. But like you were saying earlier, Anthony, about the way we see things, as you know, I'm really into dreaming, and you think dreaming in and of itself is an extraordinary phenomena that we undergo and we experience hours of every single night, and people don't really even talk about that anymore. So I think that I personally think we need to create a new intelligent, holistic well-being system that shows people and helps people develop self-sovereignty for their own health and well-being, and can provide a nurturing environment for people that have these kinds of psychic phenomena occur to them that makes them fearful or afraid. Because actually, if I was suffering from a mental health conditioning, I think going into an NHS office or a hospital would be a horrifying experience for me, because it's like this balance. I often think about the fact that prime ministers or people in power say they believe in God or go to a church, and you think there's this weird tipping point where a little bit of belief or a show of belief, it seems to be important to keep a certain proportion of the population sweet. But in reality, do any of those people that go to church because it's what we do in this country actually believe in God? Because that's quite a big statement to make, actually.
It is, and one of the things that I'm interested that you're talking about ethics, because you and I are both down in Sussex, so we need to reference Sussex as well as ethics. Sorry, it was a stupid joke. It was an old man joke. Ignore me. But I think your point is a really valid one, and it is. I think the way in which we structure everything these days is to ignore a lot of people's experiences. Natalie, I know that there are other things you want to chat about as well. So if you want to continue on.
Yes, my feeling is that we need to go along with the doctors and the healthcare practitioners, because if we're fighting against them, I think it's much more of a struggle. And I do feel that there's medical and healthcare practitioners who are aware of change, but they need support in their work in order to create it.
Yeah, I think you're quite right there. And I think that there are vested interests here as well, aren't there? In terms of medication, in terms of big pharma and everything else as well. So there are, and people have become almost dependent upon drugs to get them through the day and drugs to understand the world as well. And I think that we need to take more into account the narrative of altered states of consciousness. I mean, I was particularly intrigued, Sarah, your comment about dreams, because last night, funnily enough, I had an incredibly vivid dream involving an eagle that came to me and was in front of me. And it was only when I woke up and I thought, where did I spontaneously create that from? And the plumage of the bird was in such detail. To say that was just from my subconscious, and it looked at me with intent and intelligence. Whereas you would expect, wouldn't you, dreams to be far more ephemeral and strange and weird, but this wasn't. It seemed to be very, very real. So these places we go, the human mind is far more interesting, and it's just because we can't physically quantify it, because we can't quantify dreams, we can't measure dreams, we can't sieve dreams out, and we can't say, they're 5 kilograms in weight, they don't have extension in space, therefore they don't exist, is an incredibly restricted worldview, because the reality is that the only thing we know with any security at all is that we are perceiving something, isn't it? That's all we know. And I think that is important. It doesn't give solutions, but at least it gives us a framework for moving forward, I think.
But how does it manage with somebody like myself, who, when I was in my 20s and 30s, which it happens I no longer am, but I had visions of concentration camps and hospitals inside the camps. And I knew who I was now, and I knew who I was there. And I started looking into it, because then I found there's many other people that have experiences from the concentration camps. And then how do we explain that somebody's mental distress may come from trauma in this life, trauma from relationship, trauma from being colonized or moved from their country of origin? Or is it trauma from a different time space? How do we start to explain that in the current system?
Possibly epigenetics, maybe. You know, the developing now of epigenetics, and the idea that somehow that there's more information carried through our genes than just literally the blueprint of how to build a body. You know, that it seems that other things are carried through from life to life, or from ancestors through to descendants in some way, and that we carry these memories within ourselves, which would make logical sense, wouldn't it? That if we are evolving in order to be more effective meat machines, in order to work within this environment, there's also a logic that we're also developing psychically in order to deal with the environment we live within mentally. So in which case the experiences of your ancestors can carry through. And of course, most traditional cultures will argue, you know, the experiences of the ancestors and the involvement of the ancestors are powerful. But then we have the counter argument to say, and I discuss this in my book, The Labyrinth of Time, that time itself, we see time as a linear thing. You know, whereas time, if you look at the writings of people like Julian Barber and various other writers on time, even from St. Augustine onwards, that time is something that is very curious and very strange. We know from quantum physics that time is bizarre. And it seems that there could be concurrent times all existing at the same moment. And what we are doing, we're all individually moving through a Minkowskian block universe. But still part of our universe is still 1944, 45, 43, 44, 45 is still happening in a very real sense somewhere else that leaks through into this reality. And sensitive people can pick this up. You know, it's something Philip K. Dick called orthogonal time, the idea of a time that runs at a right angle to the time flow. So there could be something to do with this. There could be something to do with the way in which our brain can pick up information from an informational field. And again, here I'm reminded of the work of people such as, he's an ex-Catholic priest, I can't think of his name now, German-American, and the 0 point field, and the way in which the information, there seems to be an information field that we can draw upon, that we can use as experiences. Is this where dreams are seeded from? Is this
we
where
have this information field around us all the time, don't we? There is so much information now in the world that we are bombarded with the advent of media and with the advent of TV, and now with the internet, that we've never ever been exposed to as much data coming in all the time. And you think about like a TV just being on one day, how many images there are of concentration camps, of adverts, of eagles, of everything. And it's all getting into our subconscious somehow. I think that I believe that there's a collective unconscious that we can tap into. But one of the things that I find very interesting is the kind of cultural specificity of those visions, you know.
Good
like
point.
People in the Amazon rainforest probably don't think about, they probably don't have visions of being in concentration camps in Germany because they've never seen those things. And then, what's that, Natalie? Because
there's an assumption that the experiences that people have are because they've read a book or seen a program or heard the radio. And my proposition is that these things are floating around at some other level of consciousness that doesn't come through the media, may not come through the ancestral line. It's somehow that people are picking up something from some level of awareness that isn't based on what they've seen or what they've heard or what their ancestral line has heard. So sorry, I was just...
But do you think then, because one of the things that I think in terms of medical anthropology, I wonder sometimes whether Indigenous people have had brain scans to see the makeup of their brain in comparison with someone that lives in Western civilization. And I think there's ethical issues around doing that as well. But I wonder, I imagine that those kinds of experiments have been conducted at some point.
I think they did try weighing people to see if there was a soul on death, to see if they weighed a bit lighter. I
think it's 21 grams, isn't it, your soul?
Yeah. There was a writer who wrote a book on this. I think it was Mary Roach, I think, something like that. An intriguing idea that in some way that the soul has physicality, which seems to almost contradict the idea of a soul, really, to me. But an interesting idea. But then again, it is something, again, you touch in your papers, Natalie, about reincarnation and the way in which the work of Ian Stevenson and the birthmarks and the way in which birthmarks seem to carry through from incarnation to incarnation, that I've always been intrigued by, because it's a physiological effect. Again, I'd be interested as to how that mechanism really works, as to how that carries through, or whether it's somebody looking for signs. And we don't really know at all. But to me, if we're talking about epigenetics, then effectively, if people in your past that you are genetically related to have had these experiences, then you will more likely to pick them up because they're within your genes, maybe. What's your thoughts on that, Natalie?
No, there's nobody in my ancestral line who's had those experiences. So I seemed to be picking up something that wasn't in my family line. That may have been, maybe Ian Stevenson would have called it a past life, a memory of a past life that wasn't to do with my ancestors or what I'd read or seen. And it seems that there's a lot of people like me, but I was lucky because I knew who I was and I could witness what was going on. And therefore my proposition is that people who get diagnosed with seeing things or feeling things that other people can't see, I don't know where their experiences come from.
Yeah, that is interesting, isn't it? Where does it come from? Is there a collective unconscious? Is it that, as Bill Hicks famously said, are we one single consciousness experiencing itself subjectively? And is it that when we go into, and was it Buck in 1900, his book, where he discussed the idea that there is a greater consciousness that we all attune into. We're all like kind of waves of an ocean of experience. Or we're all emanations of Brahman, as the Vedanta would say. And can it be that under certain circumstances, we can attune into other people's thoughts and ideas and everything else as well? But then you've got to think, well, why that particular memory rather than another? You know, that doesn't really work, does it? Because it doesn't tell you how the selection process works in terms of this. You know, for instance, my image of the eagle, you know, it could have been from a past life, it could have been from something, but why then? What does it mean? Is it being brought up from my own subconscious, or does it mean something
spirit
new?
Animal, Anthony?
Yeah, it could be. It could be. I've never thought of myself as an eagle type person, but maybe it is, because it definitely
you're an
looked
eagle
at me.
Type person.
Pardon?
I think you're an eagle type person.
Oh, well, there you go. Maybe I'm an eagle, because it did look at me quite precisely, and it gave me an intense stare, and I thought, it's going to tear my throat out. And it didn't. It just looked at me. So maybe I was shamanic traveling and everything else as well. Right. Now, I'm aware that we're getting towards the end of the first hour. I've just had a quick check, and I'm not sure that it's telling me I'm live on Facebook, but I'm not entirely sure that we are.